started. Let's go.
Let's do it. Let's talk. We were talking about Montana, everybody. Hi, thanks for showing up. We were talking about Montana. I really like Montana. It's a beautiful place that is also home to many mixed feelings for many people for many reasons. So we were talking about mixed feelings about Montana.
All right, guys, welcome. Hello, I'm Max, and I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you all to P&P Live. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have enough time to address yours. We're also providing closed captions. If you click on CC link right next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Aubrey Gordon is a co-host of the podcast Maintenance Phase, where she and Michael Hobbs take on toxicity in the wellness industry. Their episodes cover topics such as the Atkinson and keto diets, the presidential fitness test, and a slew of holistic medicine multi-level marketing schemes. Gordon brings her sharp wit, research acumen, and both devastating and hilarious personal anecdotes to her writing once again in her second book, You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People. It is a poignant must-read for anyone who has ever wrongly argued that a caloric deficit is the only action necessary to lose weight, and an exercise in catharsis for everyone who has ever been told that a caloric deficit is the only action necessary to lose weight. Please join me in welcoming Aubrey Gordon. You're muted.
I'm talking and I'm muted. Hello. Huge thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting tonight, and to Max for that extremely lovely intro. This is the last stop on this book tour, and it is my only solo stop on this book tour. And I'm so grateful to you all. It looks like there are about 170 people, just shy, on the chat tonight, which is like absolutely incredible. And I wanted to thank you all for showing up tonight, and to everyone who has shown up at all of the stops so far. It has been an absolutely extraordinary experience. This book tour marks my third and fourth ever in-person sort of appearances since doing this work. And that is a nerve-wracking thing. And you all have made it like absolutely lovely. Because this is the last stop on the tour, I thought it would be fun to do something a little special. And I wanted to read something tonight that I haven't read before and that hasn't actually been published before. I'm going to read from a chapter from my first book that actually got cut, and rightly so, from that first book. This belongs to another book. It didn't belong in that book. It totally makes sense to me. I'm excited to read it tonight. The reason that I thought of this chapter in particular is that I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about fat softness and fat vulnerability and fat tenderness, and what it means to cultivate those things in a world that seems increasingly harsh to fat people these days. Between the AAP guidelines, the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, between the rise of Ozempic and Wegovy and the subsequent shortage for people who have type 2 diabetes, many of whom are also fat, between the Taylor Swift music video sort of fallout online, between the Oscars chatter about the whale, all of it just feels like there are so many reasons to shut down. There are so many reasons to mourn. There are so many reasons to rage. And all of those are right and just responses to what's happening around us. And also, none of those are responses that encapsulate the whole of the world that I would like to see us build toward, which is one with a lot more tenderness and softness and vulnerability in it. It is a long, hard time to be a person in this world lately. And it has been extra hard to see that for many folks, particularly throughout the pandemic, their coping mechanism for all of that difficulty was anti-fatness. That is sort of where they found comfort. They found comfort in rejecting fat people. They found comfort in complaining about the COVID-19. They found comfort in insisting that fat people were somehow to blame for a global pandemic, right? And all of that means it has been an extra hard time to be a fat person these days. So I wanted to read something that offered up some of that tenderness that feels really lacking right now, at least to me. I don't know if it is for you, but it is for me. This is from a chapter about love and relationships that was originally slated for the first book, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. It got cut because, again, it didn't quite belong. And it is called Carrying the Torch. It is called that because it never quite got to lift off. And I just named it after a song that I was listening to a lot at that point that felt like a useful concept for this chapter. So that's where that came from. I'm going to read for a little over half an hour, and then we're going to have a ton of time for Q&A. And again, I just thank you all so much for joining in tonight. Carrying the torch. Can I get your number? I was cautious. He was persuasive, his eyes bright and warm as we spoke. Aren't we having fun? Don't you want to see me again? We were, and I did. I had moved 3,000 miles from home, eager for a fresh start away from the high school where I'd been one of few queer kids and one of fewer fat kids. I moved in search of new people, promising new relationships to develop outside of the heat and pressure of my hometown. It had been 1 week since I'd moved, and the full reach of my decision hit me in waves. In my search for anonymity, I'd instead found isolation. I had moved to New England, where I didn't know a soul, and felt every inch of the distance when I sat still for too long. I was adrift at sea, and desperate to find a harbor. Here, in my new city, a lifeline appeared. I wrote my number on a cocktail napkin and handed it to him. I'll call you, he said. My skin warmed. Here was a port. I smiled nervously as he crossed the bar, traversing the waves of patrons to return to his group of friends. When he got back to his table, he was met with a chorus of shouts and laughter. One looked over at me, then another, then a third. They stared openly, unconcerned with the expressions on their faces, bold with disgust and fascination. After staring at me, they high-fived him. He looked back ruefully. The reality of what had just happened sunk into my skin, then bones, then marrow. I felt my body saturate with shame, expanding as it did. I was monstrous in my size, made bigger by humiliation. My weight made me a wager. My body was the setup, my loneliness the punchline. The joke was simple, but I wasn't in on it. Who could possibly want a fat woman? Years later, I woke up in the night next to a girlfriend who didn't last. The memory of that moment came to me in waves. It was 2 a.m. when a tsunami reached my shore. I wrote about it in a dog-eared notebook on my bedside table. Your mouth is thick with honey and crowded with bees. I imagine myself a sapling and then a flush of shame for thinking so small. At night, I feel this viscous space between us. I am a dark forest and fortunate to be so near a warm home. In order to come inside, trees must be uprooted, cut into pieces that make sense, sanded down to something you can use. The outside can never come in. It's been 14 years since that moment, but it still aches in my chest. I still feel the heat behind my eyes, the promise of sharp tears rubbing red eyes raw. I still feel the renewed nausea when he pushed me back out to sea. It was one moment in a long line of important, constant lessons about being fat and being loved. Even at 35, that moment rings in my ears every day, a tinnitus I can't shake. I hear its echo in snide remarks about thin people with fat partners. I hear it in nervous jokes about losing weight to find or keep a partner. I hear it when acquaintances tell me what a catch I'd be if I just lost weight. Every day, the specter of its memory is visited upon me. Every day, someone says something about how impossible it is to desire a fat person, much less love one. Later that year, friends congregated in the campus dining hall. "I'm just here to hang out. I'm not eating," one offered up unprompted. "I'm trying to hook up." "Can I get your number?" At work, years later, a lesbian colleague looked at a magazine article about newlywed gay couples and heaved a belabored sigh. "I wish they wouldn't show the fat lesbians," she announced. "Some of us are fit. How did she land a wife anyway?" Aren't we having fun? Last month, a man sent me a message on a dating app. "Why are you sabotaging yourself on here?" Confused, I asked him what he meant. "Picture 3 seems included solely to negate the cuteness of pics 1 and 2. What's your play?" The first 2 were photographs of my face. The third was my body. Don't you want to see me again? Fat people are reminded every day that we are objects of proud revulsion. When we dare to aspire to love, real, reciprocal, respectful, deep, boundless love, we are slapped back without hesitation or remorse. We are expected to be grateful that anyone wants us, even if that desire shows up as assault or abuse. We are subject to humiliation for daring to express our interest in someone else. Many who fall for fat people learn to hide their feelings after years of being told their desire isn't real or rational, as if desire can be reasoned with. We learn simple lessons, that bees sting, that fire burns, that open affection cannot be trusted, and that love is not for bodies like ours. If we are to be fat, we cannot also be loved. My first love came just months after that barroom bet. Risk-taking had never been a strong suit of mine, but at 21, I discovered a deep drive to get away, to transfer to another college, to build a new life. In that new life, I told myself I'd be a writer. I'd apply to the jobs I most wanted and to the graduate level courses I longed to take. I'd say yes to any new opportunities that came my way. I'd break myself of what I then believed to be the habit of anxiety. I would, I told myself, become a risk taker. And I did. I started writing plays, submitting them to festivals, seeing my own work staged by actors I like and critiqued by and complimented by writers I admired. I said yes to parties and weekend trips. I took graduate seminars with professors and students I looked up to. My brain buzzed and popped like neon, electric with the charge of new ideas and a bolder self. I was uncovering the contours of who I could be when I wrangled my fear, and I loved the shape I was taking. The deepest risk-taking challenge was dating. I hadn't seen anyone since my first girlfriend, nor had I made sense of the relationship or the breakup. Even after a year, it still felt too tender to divulge, even in confidence, to a therapist. I told myself I simply hadn't hung in there. I wasn't a convincing enough cool girl. If I tried harder, suppressed the hurt feelings I was certain were unearned and unjustified, I knew I could do better next time. I had to hope for some hypnotized partner to fall in love with my inner beauty. I had to pray for lightning to strike me a second time. That's when I met him. He went to art school. He was impossibly cool and still warm, present, open, and earnest. On an early date, he invited me to a student show of his photography. Haunting photographs hung on the walls, a ghostly kind of self-portrait of his changing body. He had started testosterone shortly before we met, and the double-exposed photos showed his body growing wild as springtime. He held my hand as we walked through the exhibit, and I squeezed it every time I felt an ache for him. It wasn't long before I fell in love with him in his body, and before he fell in love with me in mine. We lived 2 states away from each other and would meet in the middle on the weekends. He was effortlessly stylish, his hair artfully disheveled, Sharpie scrawled t-shirts, headphones constantly playing Sonic Youth and Scout Niblet. I, by contrast, lined my lips and winged my eyeliner, wore fitted dresses and bright cardigans, all overachievement and eagerness. He was too cool for me. I was too high-strung for him. Still, we tempered each other. He wrote me letters nearly every day, and I responded like clockwork. His love letters landed like a blow, knocking the wind out of me. I wrote back on thick paper, which he hung around his bedroom mirror. You say such nice things about me, he said. I figure if I keep looking at them, I'll start to believe it. We daydreamt of the life we'd build together. He'd be a photographer and I would write plays. I told him how I longed to write on my grandmother's old typewriter, how much I loved the hard clack of its keys and the electric history that ran through its analog machinery. I told him the thought of writing on it made me homesick. For my birthday, he found its twin, the same make and model that my grandmother had used. Now you can be homesick for me. We planned a post-graduation move to Boston. I started researching jobs. He started looking for apartments. I imagined a brightly colored studio, my new typewriter perched on a sunny kitchen table. I imagined loving the space and him in it. I imagined his bright future, the art openings, the promise of his young career, how he would blossom and soften in adulthood. But every time I imagined our future, I couldn't imagine myself. This beautiful life belonged to someone else, and he deserved someone better, someone easier, prettier, cooler, and of course, someone thinner. I had aimed too high, presumed too much. This wasn't my future. It was too promising, too bright, and I hadn't earned it. This was the future of a thin woman. I had never seen a fat woman in love, not in life, not in media. I had never seen fat women who dated. I had never seen fat women who asserted themselves, whose partners respected them. Because this was uncharted territory, I assumed it was also unexplored. My risk-taking resolve ebbed from my soft body. The shape of it, its size, looked ridiculous. How could he love me if it meant loving this? Didn't he deserve more, better? Didn't he deserve a partner who made sense? There was no roadmap for being loved as a fat woman, no path for me to follow to this unfamiliar destination. The only options I knew were ridicule and loneliness. Despite having what was described as a very pretty face, I was constantly reminded that my body was impossible to want. We were dating at the height of the popularity of shows like Hot or Not and television shows like The Swan. Everywhere I looked, bodies were openly critiqued and ranked, and mine steadily landed near the bottom of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4. His thinness alone earned him a much higher standing. In the cruel calculus of dating and relationships, our numbers didn't match. But it wasn't just him. I had learned that I was undesirable to nearly anyone. Desire for a body like mine meant partners were irrational, stupid, or resigned to settling for less than they wanted. In the years since my first breakup, I had struggled to accept interest where I found it. However a potential partner looked, no matter how enthusiastic they were, I could not trust their attraction. I shrank away from their touch, recoiling from them as if it were dangerous as an open flame, believing their interest to be impossible or pathological. Any intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability inevitably led back to humiliation. This is among the greatest triumphs of anti-fatness. It stops us before we start. Its greatest victory isn't diet industry sales or lives postponed just until I lose a few more pounds. It's the belief that our bodies make us so worthless that we aren't deserving of love, even touch. It's the moment that our reviled role sinks into our bones. It's when we reproduce it in our marrow. We become its photosynthesis. Over the coming weeks, as these little fissures opened into wounds, I dressed them by retelling myself the story of our relationship. It had always been impossible, too beautiful and tender to be true. Maybe he had taken pity on me, doing a charitable deed by showing affection to a pitiable girl. Maybe I had misread little signals, created some ethereal fantasy life for us in my lonely fat girl imagination. Or maybe, like the men in the bar, this had all been a long grift, some cruel joke that outlived its humor. I told myself he didn't want to be with me. I told myself he was too gentle to do what he knew he needed to be done and dump me. I told myself the best thing I could do for him was leave. So I did. His letters still arrived daily while mine slowed to a trickle. Like a car out of gas, our relationship coasted to a halt. I moved back to my hometown and he to a new city. The promise of that bright, beautiful life together faded into the background, and I tried not to stare too long at its light. A few years later, I met someone new. We met on a dating app and texted for weeks while both of us worked up the nerve to schedule a real date. I had worked through my standard battery of pre-date questions, particularly formulated for the straight men I rarely dated. I had honed their order and their delicate wording over time. Question 1, do you usually go for fat women? Or will I be your first? Will your unresolved feelings about desiring a fat person come out with me? And will I need to field a slew of awkward remarks and movements? Are you familiar with the pressures of dating a fat person, or will it all be new? Will you expect me to do the hard work of confronting your anti-fatness alone? Do you know how to defend your desire when your friends and family reject it? Will you expect me to take your attraction as a once-in-a-lifetime compliment? Question 2, have you ever dated a fat woman? Dated, not slept with, not found attractive, not fantasized about. No, dated, courted, wooed. Have you ever held a fat partner's hand in public? Have you brought her home for the holidays, introduced her to your friends? Has she reached the status that a thinner girlfriend might? Or do you hide fat partners in your bed? Evidence of a desire you're certain you ought not have. Do you usher them out the back door so your friends and roommates don't see the women you most want and don't ridicule the desire that already brings you so much shame? What will become of me when that shame becomes too great, when you need to destroy any evidence of us? Both questions deliberately include the phrase fat woman, not big girl, not more to love, not BBW, decidedly, importantly, fat woman. That phrase alone has weeded out dozens of potential dates. If they do not know how to name my body, they certainly won't know how to care for it or how to respect it. But this one felt different. He gave enthusiastic answers to both questions about his genuine desire for and long-term relationships with fat women. He told me about bringing fat women home, how his parents loved his last girlfriend. He made it even to the third and trickiest question, what do you love most about dating a fat woman? This then was where I could find those whose desire ended at specific fantasies, often sprung on me without warning or consent. This is where crass responses gave themselves away. They're so eager to please. But again, his answers were different. So we met. He was already at the bar when I walked in. Never much of a drinker, I nursed my cocktail, accustomed to being outpaced. He was on his third beer when he opened up. He showed me a picture of his former body some years earlier, nearly 100 pounds heavier, grimacing as he held the phone out. Pretty big difference, right? I felt my muscles tense, taut as rubber bands. At a loss for words, I nodded while he ordered his fourth beer. I had long since learned that interrupting a formerly fat person's weight loss journey never ended well. Even gentle interruptions could result in sharp rebukes. You know what I like about you? He offered abruptly. You're all about like fat pride. I like that. Be proud of your body. You know, I used to be like that until I realized I wanted anyone to sleep with me ever, he said, chuckling, his warm eyes hazy with alcohol. He looked to me to join in on the joke. I didn't. I changed the subject quickly, but was still reeling from his comment. He was talking about his body, but he was also talking about mine. If his fat body had been categorically unfuckable, so was mine. I felt myself wilt. This person had been so kind and thoughtful, so flirtatious and respectful for the long days leading up to this moment. He'd passed the battery of questions designed to screen for moments like these, and the system had failed. Now, this slow and steady deflation. I shrank, feeling so foolish for pinning my hopes on the simple promise of someone new. Regardless of their gender or age, this moment always seemed to arrive with new romantic prospects. The moment when their thoughts about bodies like mine betrayed our budding relationship. Queer people and straight people, people of all genders, younger dates and older, everyone could agree that a body like mine was at best a pity and at worst a death sentence, deserved for my flagrant disregard of my responsibility to be thin. I had learned to jump ship early so that I wouldn't have to face the later fights about money or family or life priorities, or my fatness would suddenly reappear, leaping out once again, some weapon of war catapulting me back into such deep shame, not because of my own body, but because I'd naively overlooked the early red flags. If we stayed together, I would remember this moment. I would resent myself for it. The signs were all there. We spoke just long enough for me to flag down the server for our check. My date was drunk now, slurring and speaking just loud enough to be heard at both of our neighboring tables at the long banquette. After we paid, he walked me to the sidewalk. I asked where he was parked, hoping I could tell him I was in the opposite direction. He said he'd taken the train. But I could ride with you if you want to go back to my place. He dragged his fingertip along my forearm. My amygdala was staging a coup, kicking its way out into the rest of my brain, and my body became certain that I needed to flee. I've got to be up early tomorrow, I offered. Your place, then? I had no doubt that he was attracted to me. That never felt up for debate, but the way he talked about bodies like mine were still as something to be pitied or reviled, even if he wanted them. When I looked at his reality, the reality of being so afraid of his own desire, the love and want he felt for women who looked like me, my heart went out for him. He had such conflicted feelings about his own desire, it must have been terrible. But when I looked at what that meant for my reality, I became irritated, and that irritation grew to anger. He was conflicted, yes, and that must have been difficult for him, but that same ambivalence is what would inevitably leave both of us humiliated and hurt. It would hold me and undoubtedly, it would hold me and undoubtedly other fat women at arm's length. In other men, it might spark anger, and that anger might spill into violence or assault. My heart ached for his uncertainty, but it broke for my safety. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I wondered what gave him such a certain entitlement to sublimate his ambivalence by so openly insulting bodies like mine, like his once was, while even still courting and longing for them. I wanted to ask him when his approach had ever worked. What woman fell for you after you told her she was undesirable? I wanted him to tell me, to have to tell me, that he would never say such a thing to a thinner woman. I wanted him to tell me, to have to tell me, that he wanted me, but that his desire was suffocated by his shame. But more than all of that, I wanted to leave. Looking at his face in that moment was a painful reminder of what I'd always been told were the two paths for fat women: be lonely or be mistreated. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. He texted me a few days later, telling me that he'd had a good time and really did want to find some time to have me over. I knew I owed him a direct answer. I don't remember how the conversation unfolded, but I remember how it ended. I told him he didn't want me, or at least that he didn't want to want me. Why would you say that? Don't I get to decide? He asked. Through the blue light of my phone screen, I couldn't tell if his tone was sharp or plaintive. I decided it didn't matter. I wanted to be upfront, to do what I knew was right, to tell him the truth, to get candid with him. I'm too fat for you, I texted back. His protests were fervent. I wasn't fat, I was beautiful. If I'd been too fat for him, he insisted, he would have told me. He didn't remember that he already had. Over the coming weeks, he texted incessantly, seemingly every few hours. He wanted to know what I was doing, where I was, who I was with. He wanted to know when we could see each other again. I had been as direct as I knew how and had already told him I didn't plan to see him again, but it never seemed to land. I met his frequent messages with a fear I forever tempered but never fully repressed. I was afraid of responding and afraid of staying silent. His persistence made me feel surprisingly unsafe. Suddenly, I found myself grateful to live in a city, grateful not to have told him where I lived, grateful he never learned the cross streets of my office building or my home. Over time, he would have to lose interest, and he did. Where even are you? He texted one day after months of half-finished exchanges. In Montana, I said, on a trip with my best friends. I answered from a cabin near Flathead Lake, relieved that my excuse was the truth. You always say that. No one has that many best friends. I do, I answered truthfully. He never responded. For years, my body took center stage in my dating life. Dates constantly commented on my size, a knee-jerk reaction to their discomfort with their own desire. Over time, I came to experience any attraction as untrustworthy, as if danger lurked nearby. I worried for my bodily safety, as if only violence could develop an appetite for a body as soft as mine. And I worried that I would become a curio, more novel than loved. In a world so insistent that fat attraction is impossible, some fat people can end up experiencing all attraction as a potential threat, as I did. And the culture around us reinforces that at every turn. So regardless of our size, we come to assume that most, if not all, fat attraction is pathological. But when we do that, we imply that only thin people are worthy of genuine attraction. That like health, happiness, and success, love can only be earned by thinness. Our inability to distinguish predatory sexual appetites from everyday desire ends up reinforcing the idea that thin people lead fuller lives, deserve more, are more loved and more desirable. But I don't choose to believe that. I choose to believe that fat people can be genuinely attractive, truly loved, actually lovable, sincerely wanted. I cannot change, not single-handedly, the very real harms that many fat people face in romantic and sexual relationships, nor can I wish those away for myself or other fat people. But I can choose to work toward a world that not only accepts fat people, but that embraces our many facets, including our desirability. I believe that my fat friends and family members who are in love are loved fully, are fulfilled in those relationships, and that their partners are not somehow damaged for wanting them. I believe that my past loves with fat partners weren't some symptom of a sinister sickness for either of us, but something real and worthwhile. I reject the notion that fat attraction is necessarily tawdry, comic, vulgar, or dangerous. I choose to believe that my body is worthy of love, the electric warmth of real, full love. I believe that I deserve to be loved in my body, not in spite of it. My body is not an inconvenience, a shameful fact, or an unfortunate truth. Wanting my body is not a pathological act. I choose love that wants all of me. I choose love that can embrace my depth and breadth alike. And I'm not alone. Despite the never-ending headwinds, fat people around the world find and forge the relationships they want. There is still no roadmap, so we become cartographers, charting some new land for ourselves. We live extraordinary lives, beloved by our families, partners, communities. Fat people fall wildly in love. Fat people get married. Fat people have phenomenal sex. Fat people are impossibly happy. Those fat people live in defiance of the expectations set forth for them. Their fat lives are glorious and beautiful things, vibrant and beyond the reach of what the rest of us have been trained to imagine. Their happiness and boundless love was inconceivable to the young men who watched me in the bar. It was unimaginable to me, even though I was living it when I left my first love. Our culture makes fat happiness, fat romance, fat sex, and fat love unthinkable to many of us. But loving a fat person isn't impossible. The trick is to build a culture that allows us, all of us, to believe fat love when we see it. There you go. Happy February. Happy Valentine's Day month, everybody.
Thank you so much, Aubrey.
Sure thing.
So based on time, are we cool running just straight into Q&A?
Let's do it.
Awesome. We've got some questions lined up, but if you guys in the crowd have any, just send them on in. The Q&A is right next to, down on that bottom.
Excellent.
All right. I'm just going to kind of read them in order as we start off and then kind of jump around as we go on. The first one is from Lauren. Advice for raising a baby in this diet-obsessed world, especially when grandparents are deeply entrenched.
Oh, have I got the thing for you? Okay, so this is a question that historically would have been a real stumper for me until Virginia Soulsmith wrote this book that is coming out in like a month, like not very long. It's called Fat Talk: Parenting in the Age of Diet Culture. And it is one of the best reported and most sharply observed books that I have read on fatness in a long time, but particularly on what our sort of discourse around fatness means and how it shows up in the lives of kids, both in the lives of fat kids who are sort of, trained to accept a level of sort of like passive disregard or abuse or what have you, and also in the lives of kids who are not fat, who learn that their bodies are being surveilled. The way to separate themselves out is to treat fat kids badly so that you're not associated with fat kids, right? It's an absolutely brilliant book, and I can't recommend it highly enough. That's what I would say.
All right. Awesome. Great recommendation. Okay, this one's from an anonymous. Hey, Aubrey, thanks for being here and for voicing your thoughts about the recent AAP guidelines. Do you plan to do a deeper dive on these on the Maintenance Phase podcast sometime soon? And what's your advice for educators navigating this sensitive landscape?
Boy, oh boy. So answer one is easy. Yes, it's Tuesday. That's Tuesday's episode. We're talking about the AAP guidelines. You can just listen to me crumble into dust about what all of this means for how we think about and treat fat kids. Advice for educators. I would say a couple of things. One, having grown up as a fat kid and knowing other people who grew up as fat kids and knowing fat kids now, there are lots and lots and lots of people telling you to lose weight and lots of people telling you to love your body. And they're often telling you to do those same things in the same breath, right? That people will be like, you should love yourself. You're great. You're perfect, but also change immediately and completely right now. Do it now. Go. So like step one is like, don't be that guy. Don't be the guy who says those two things. Everybody's saying those two things. The problem isn't that fat kids or fat adults even don't want to love themselves. The problem is that we have created a culture that makes that almost impossible, if not just extremely difficult for fat folks. So, I mean, listen, if I think about what would have stood out to me as a fat kid, two things would have stood out to me. One, unconditional advocacy from an adult that was not hinged on when you lose weight, that was not hinged on when you've been growing out, now you're going to grow up and then you'll be thinner and right? Like not that kind of advocacy, but people who I knew were in my corner no matter what, regardless of my size, regardless of my queerness, regardless of my anything, were the people who meant the most in the world to me. And if I think about one thing that would have been really, really helpful to me as a fat kid, it would have been someone not just saying, hey, don't reduce people to their bodies or don't comment on people's bodies or blah, 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 but like saying actually good things about fat people, right? Like actually actively saying, it's fine to be a fat person and fat people are great. Look at all these great fat people. Don't you love Lizzo? How you feel about, I don't know, Taft? There have been fat people. We could look, John Goodman, fat guy. Look at that, right? There are so many people to look to. There are so many people to lift up. And the place where it feels like even to this day, adults seem to stop short of in the lives of fat kids is actually just saying a straightforwardly good thing about fat people and fatness in general. I would say that's a pretty good one. It can be a hill to climb, but I trust that you can figure it out.
Kind of going off of that, this is where I started jumping around from Nicole. Specifically, what would you say to you in high school?
Oh, okay. This is a question I've gotten before, and here's what I would say. I wouldn't say anything to me. I would say things to the adults in my orbit. Right? Like, I actually think like this is a question that comes from a good place. It comes from a survivalist, kind of like an emotional survivalist place. And I would like to get us to the point where kids don't have to be emotional survivalists to like make it through their education and to make it through their school years. That would be great. So listen, I would say to the advisor of student activities at my high school who said that we didn't need a gay straight alliance because we were more progressive than that, that wasn't actually his call. It was a straight dude. I would tell my health teachers at school and PE teachers both that they were relying on kids that reminded them of them and relating most to the kids that reminded them of themselves. And that isn't actually like the venture of an educator, that's the venture of a friend. You're trying to make friends with your students. Your job is to educate your students. I feel like there are like lots and lots of things like that. I would talk to my pediatrician and ask why she was recommending something that she didn't have an evidence-based course of treatment for, right? Like there's just like so many, like I feel like the interventions here are not actually with kids, are not actually with our younger selves, but are with the adults who were sort of setting the context and setting the container for how we were expected and allowed to see ourselves, if that makes sense.
Total sense. From Kennedy, kind of similar. What are things you say to interrupt anti-fatness in a convo with family and friends? Now, they say they often feel they have to backtrack, explain, or very carefully ask leading questions. I'd like to shut it down and not be everyone's teacher at times, which totally understandable, for sure.
For sure. Okay. Shut it down options. One, if they're talking about diets, my most shut it down mode, I've talked about this before, is I don't want to hear everything you're doing to avoid looking like me. People will stop talking after that. You got to be okay with discomfort, but like it's happening, you know, it's happening. I would say, I have said in the past, I know you to be a smarter and more compassionate person than this. This is confusing to me why you're talking this way. You are generally really thoughtful and respectful, and yet still we're talking about fat people and you're turning it into garbage. What's going on? That's a good shut them down. And also like, listen, I think kind of all of us anticipate before you really get into the sort of muck of like actually setting boundaries around this stuff, we envision that everything is going to be the goddamn Lincoln Douglas debates, and it's just not. Do you know what I mean? Like, we have all done this before. We have all shut down family members who are saying things that are like totally out of pocket. We've all addressed this stuff many, many times before. And we all know deep down that one of the things that can shut that down is if you just go, hey, knock it off. Just like, you know what I mean? Like, you really don't have to have like a speech prepared. You can, if you want to, you can refer folks to books or movies or other resources if you want to do that. Like, you can have the whole conversation and lead them through the whole thing. And also sometimes you're just trying to watch a movie and you don't want to hear their anti-fat garbage behind you. And you just go, hey, knock it off. I have been served very well by that. I will also say my relationship to experiencing anti-fatness from my family and friends has changed pretty dramatically since doing this work, because everyone is afraid that I'm going to put them on the podcast, which I am not going to do and would not do. So I will also say, that kind of stuff comes to me more through work than through friends and family these days. So like, grain of salt, you have a more recent and fresh real world experience with this than I do. That's what I would say.
From Kristen, have you ever witnessed a real change in someone you've known with intense fat phobia?
Oh, holy shit. Yes. Sorry for swearing, but yes. I have, and I will say that person was a good friend for a long time who would do things, who's also an organizer, who would do things that are very common amongst organizers on the left, which is when you don't like someone, call them fat. When you think someone's politics are bad, call them stupid and fat, right? Like there's like a little playbook of like, here's how you reject people whose politics you don't like. And it's never on the merits. It's often sort of on their appearance, on their body, on their speech patterns, on their whatever. I had, when I was very first writing as your fat friend, before I was sort of like no longer anonymous, I sent her a piece to proofread before I put it up. I wanted her feedback on it because I was also just like, this is one way I can be sure you're going to read this. Boop. And I sent her that piece. It was a piece about what it's like to sit on a plane as a fat person. And the next time I talked to her, she was like, hey, another friend of ours came to visit. She kept talking about how terrible it was to sit next to a fat person on the plane. And I was like, hey, you know they don't measure those seatbelts, right? You know they don't tell people the size of the seats. You know they'll just kick fat people off the plane and they won't even tell them why. And they won't give them a refund. They won't do anything. Like, knock it off. Like, you need to figure that out. Like, that's not on them. That's on like Boeing and Airbus and whoever. Like, that's on much bigger forces than the fat person who like rolled the dice and sat next to you. And she like told me this whole story, and I was like, is she trying to prove to me that she's like is not anti-fat? Like, what's going on here? And at the end, she went, so I just wanted to know if you had any notes for me. Is that like the right way to do that, or should I do it differently next time? And I was like, oh, we have had like a complete about face, right? That like not only has this person like had a moment with their own anti-fatness, and I have absolutely never heard them say another garbage thing again after that. But like, I don't think it was the piece that I wrote. I think it was seeing that kind of vulnerability from someone that they cared about that sort of like flipped it around for them. So that was a pretty huge change for me. And that is a person who, like many people that I know, is involved in policymaking and is now involved in policymaking to like do some like harm reduction work around fat kids. So it's like really genuinely good. That kind of stuff is very possible and has been on my mind a lot lately in terms of like, and something that I would urge folks here to think about is there's a lot of talk in nonprofit spaces about like your theory of change. How do you think change happens? And what I would urge folks to do in your own individual lives is when you notice someone who you think needs to move on this issue, pay attention to when and whether they change and what are the circumstances that make that possible, and then repeat that pattern with them, whether or not it's an approach that feels like your own approach, whether or not it's how you think things ought to work. Like, the goal is to get that person where they need to be. And sometimes that means we adapt to create that kind of change. And it'll be like uncomfortable, but it's worth like grounding our approaches to change, not only in what we want to see, but also in how we observe that change to happen in individuals and in institutions around us. And that felt like a great crash course for me. And like, oh, that's how this friend changes. I just got to get real honest and real sincere with her every once in a while, and she'll like snap to and like get in line. It was like very helpful. Yeah.
From an anonymous attendee, your vulnerability is incredible and admirable. It is shown in your books, your podcast, and your blog posts. I agree with this. So.
Thanks, Max.
How did you, and I want to know, how did you get to the point where you saw vulnerability was a strength, especially in a world that doesn't value it at all?
It's not. It's like a weakness. Vulnerability is totally a weakness. You're like, here's my weakest part. Go in, do what you got to do. And that's actually how, in my own observations of how change happens, that's actually how change happens. People don't, again, just in my own observed experience of the world, people don't really change their minds based on like facts and figures. People are not doing deep reads of like JAMA studies. People are not like going in hard to fact check themselves or expecting to be fact checked. we think that the text is the most important part of a conversation, but there is also like a subtext that is a relationship message about that conversation. And I think if we can get the relationship message right on this kind of stuff, we get ourselves a lot further than if we try and build an ironclad case, right? And it felt to me like if I was going to write about this stuff, and if I was going to write in the way that I started out early on, which was like writing letters to thin people that I knew about what I needed from them, that was going to have to include a really clear relationship message about how much I loved and valued those people and why they were worth all of this work and why I wanted to have this tough conversation with them, even though it was tough. Felt really important as a way of saying, I love you and I care about you and our relationship is not at risk here. And I don't want it to be at risk, but I need you to understand that you're causing me some real pain and some real harm and giving me a lot to deal with here. I don't think you mean to do that. And I really believe that in my heart of hearts. But yeah, it felt important to write things in a way that honored those relationships and also that like made space for folks to reconsider their actions, not as a reflection of the totality of their character. Right? So that I could say, you did this thing and it really hurt me. And it didn't have to turn into, therefore you are a bigot and I reject all of you and everything you're about, right? If I did that, that would be almost everyone I know. If I cut off everybody who said the anti-fat thing, that would include me. That would include me, right? Like there's gotta be some room for folks to grow, not ad infinitum, not to suck up all your time and energy and all of that kind of stuff, but like there's got to be some space for folks to grow and shift and change and all of this kind of stuff. And to my mind, the quickest way to foster vulnerability is to model vulnerability. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so this is going to be our last question before we start saying goodbye. Awesome chapter. First of all, this is from Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon.
You are Shannon's favorite writer.
Oh, thanks, Shannon.
But their question is, how did you get so good at public speaking? You speak with such conviction and authenticity, somehow managing to be as captivating as you are informative. Any tips? We could all use them.
Oh, why, thank you. Oh my God. I'm a bad person to ask this question because I just have not really ever felt big nerves around public speaking kind of stuff. I have talked about this before, that I spent years as an organizer, and my job was basically for several of those years was just to like knock on people's doors and be like, I'm a gay person, should I have anything? And it just feels like after you sort of like go through that gauntlet, everything feels easier than that, right? I think the lesson that I have learned most in the last like 2 years on this front is that I feel like my sort of public speaking kind of stuff is at its best when I feel grounded in who I am and how I really, really actually feel about things. So that I'm not all wound up and spring-loaded with rage, but I'm also not trying to smooth everything over and make it okay for everybody, right? But I'm actually able to say, hey, yeah, things are good over here, except I'll tell you what, it's like ruining my life is these AAP guidelines. It's making me so sad, right? Like being able to speak to both of those things at the same time and feel grounded in both of those things being true feels like the most important ingredient to me, is like that little set of grounding is what I would say.
Very good.
I don't know. That's a listen, again, as with my PE teachers were bad influences for people who were never great at PE, and similar, because they just didn't know how to work through stuff, right? And similarly, I think I'm bad on the public speaking end because I enjoy it and have not, felt icky about it. So I would say just talk to other people who have nerves about it. I'm not one of them. I'm a weirdo. I'm not one of them.
You are every university public speaking professor's dream. Someone who enjoys that gen ed class.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so final question from us at Politics and Prose. What are you currently reading or would like to suggest to the viewers tonight?
Oh, okay. So I did just finish this one. I'm coming back to Virginia's book. It's outstanding. It comes out again in like 3 weeks, a month, something like that. It's just phenomenal. I blurbed it and I would blurb it again. It's great. I am also about to start. It arrives in, I think, a week is when pre-orders are like done-ish, and it actually comes out. Clarkeisha Kent has a book coming out called Fat Off, Fat On that I'm extremely excited to read. And I am, because I am a weird, boring person in a lot of ways. I am reading it's called, sort of considered to be the first diet book currently, which is William Banting's guide to, they called it like banting instead of dieting. Banting was the verb. Do you bant? So I'm like reading that absolutely nonsense garbage book about the trouble with corporeal people. I'm like, I think we're all corporeal people. Whoops. Oh no, do you know people who don't have bodies? I don't. Whoops. Okay. Yeah, so that's what I'm reading. But the real recommendations are Virginia Solesmith's Fat Talk, Parenting in the Age of Diet Culture, and Clarkeisha Kent's Fat Off, Fat On, A Big Bitch Manifesto. Both of those, one of them is incredible, the other one looks incredible. I'm excited about both of them.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Banting sounds so Valley of the Dolls. So
it's so dystopian. It's so dystopian. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh,
like a hot robot is asking you if you're banting. Absolutely. There's no question.
Oh goodness. I don't want that future.
I don't either. That sounds bad. Oh. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for rescheduling.
Oh my gosh.
So glad you're feeling better. So glad that we're on the right track, and I'm glad you were here tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. Politics and Prose is so grateful. Your patronage is what enabled us to bring you programming like this, and we cannot continue to do this without your support. If you want to purchase, you just need to lose weight and 19 other myths about fat people, and kind of have people get a little off put by the title at first, and then be like, oh, word, I would love to read that.
Yeah.
You can at the link in the chat or at politics-prose.com. We do hope to see you guys at our next event. If you'd like to check out the full listing, that is on the Politics-Prose website as well. And stay well read, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Aubrey.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.